There is something that many men only understand when it is too late, and it doesn't just have to do with what they say or do in an obvious way. In reality, it's related to something much quieter, something she'll probably never explain to you, but that can completely change the way she perceives you. If you stay until the end of this video, you will discover why some relationships start out full of hope and over time end with an emotional distance that seems impossible to repair. Before we begin, if this type of content helps you better understand female psychology and strengthen your relationships, consider subscribing to the channel. Perhaps it is no coincidence that this video has appeared in front of you. Now pay close attention. Many men believe that respect within a relationship is something permanent, something that, once earned, remains forever. However, the psychology of attraction and emotional bonding works in a much more dynamic way. Respect is not a title or a fixed label. It is a perception that constantly changes depending on your actions, your reactions, and above all, the way you manage your emotions in and around life. This is where a part begins that few people explain clearly. A woman rarely loses respect for a man overnight, nor does it usually happen because of a single mistake or an isolated argument. Although many believe it, the reality is usually much more subtle. Respect begins to erode little by little through small moments in which she perceives something that many women deeply value: emotional coherence. When you say one thing and then do another, when you set a boundary but then abandon it for fear of making her uncomfortable, or when you react from anxiety instead of responding calmly. It's not about being perfect, it's about being consistent. From a psychological perspective, the human mind looks for signs of stability, and within a relationship, that stability becomes a sense of emotional security. When that confidence begins to weaken, it slowly changes the way she perceives you as well, even if she never puts it into words. It is also important to clarify something. This does not mean controlling, dominating, or imposing. That is not respect. That's fear. And fear never builds healthy relationships. The respect we talk about comes from another perception. The feeling that you have control over yourself, that you maintain your emotional balance, and that you do not need to constantly prove your worth. Without realizing it, many men begin to seek too much validation when insecurities arise. They ask more than necessary, insist too much, or give in too quickly to avoid conflicts. Even if their intentions are good, the psychological message they convey can be very different, that your emotional stability depends on the other person's response. Over time, that dynamic can upset the emotional balance of the relationship. The most important thing is to understand that this does not happen because of a lack of love or because a man has less value. In most cases, it happens due to lack of emotional awareness. Many were never taught to observe how they react internally within a relationship. No one showed them how to identify whether they are acting from calm or anxiety. And when that awareness does not exist, it is very easy to lose balance without even noticing it. The interesting thing is that, in most cases, she does not consciously analyze all this either. Don't sit down and think step by step about what's happening. It is an emotional perception that is formed over time. Small signals repeated over and over again end up creating a general impression, and that impression is what little by little begins to define the dynamic between the two. Therefore, what you really need to understand is not how to become someone else, but what your behavior is communicating when no one explains in words what is happening deep in the relationship. This is where many men often get confused. They believe that respect disappears because of a big mistake, a strong argument, or a wrong decision. However, from the psychology of relationships, perception rarely changes due to a single event. What really makes the difference is the accumulation of small, repeated behaviors over time. Imagine a container that fills drop by drop. Every impulsive reaction, every moment you abandon your own boundaries to avoid conflict, and every decision made out of fear seem insignificant separately. But when those small actions accumulate, they begin to modify the emotional perception of the relationship. When respect begins to wane, there is usually no dramatic scene that announces it. In their place, much more discreet signs appear. You may notice less admiration in the way he looks at you, less initiative to reach out emotionally, or a greater distance in the way he responds. Many men interpret these changes as sudden disinterest, when in reality they are the result of a process that has been developing for some time. There is a very important psychological principle. Respect doesn't just depend on what you do when everything is going well, but on how you handle your emotions when things don't go as you expected. Staying calm in the face of frustration conveys stability. On the other hand, reacting impulsively or losing control easily can communicate emotional insecurity. This doesn't mean you should hide what you feel. Repressing emotions is not a healthy solution either. True emotional maturity consists of feeling them without allowing them to control each of your decisions. Feeling is completely normal. Letting emotions direct all your behavior is something very different. Without realizing it, many men make the relationship the center of their emotional stability. Her mood depends on how she responds. Your peace of mind depends on the care you receive. Your security changes depending on the validation you get. Although from the outside this is not always evident, emotionally it is usually perceived. And the most important thing is that she does not need to consciously analyze it. The human emotional system detects patterns long before the mind can explain them logically. Therefore, sometimes a woman may feel that something has changed without being able to express exactly what she perceives to be different. Here appears a very important aspect that many people overlook. When the perception of respect begins to diminish, the most common reaction is to try to regain it by doing more. More attention, more messages, more explanations, and more effort. However, from a psychological point of view, acting out of insecurity rarely changes that initial perception. In some cases, it can even reinforce it, because instead of transmitting stability, it communicates emotional need. And when the emotional need becomes too evident, the dynamics of the relationship begin to feel heavier. This doesn't mean there is something wrong with you. It is simply a very common human pattern. The good news is that respect is usually not rebuilt with intensity, but with consistency. It is constant actions that show that you are capable of maintaining your emotional balance, even when the situation is uncomfortable. This also involves developing a skill that is not easy for many men: learning to tolerate silence, accept uncertainty, and not feel anxious when an answer does not come immediately. It is precisely in these moments that the true emotional state of a person is revealed. Not when everything is going well, but when circumstances are no longer under control. If while listening to this video you begin to recognize some of these situations in your own experience, do not take it as a reason to feel guilty. The goal is not to judge you, but to help you develop greater awareness. Because what we are not able to see, we cannot change either. And what is never corrected ends up repeating itself over and over again. There is a time in many relationships when the dynamic stops being evident and begins to become almost invisible. It is no longer words